Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Today on Central Booking, a return visit with award-winning author V.P. Morris. Morris's second suspense novel, Dead Ringer, is out now, and it's got a killer hook. 21-year-old Taylor Callahan is a small-time criminal with a big-time opportunity to begin her life anew. When teenage doppelganger Jamie Mackenzie is gunned down in a case of mistaken identity, Taylor takes over her life by assuming her persona. All she has to do is convince local authorities, the girl's friends and schoolmates, and Jamie's family that she's the real deal. Twisted, right? But not nearly as twisted as what awaits her as a member of the Mackenzie family. V.P. Morris's other works include the serial killer thriller Shadowcast, 3 Kindle shorts, Exit 13, January release, and Legacy Employees, and the award-winning podcast The Dead Letters. Dead Ringer continues that twisty-turny tradition. Fellow mystery maven Megan Collins enthused, come for the brilliant premise, stay for the chilling reveals. Dead Ringer is a dark, page-turning thriller that proves that even the happiest families have secrets worth burying. Now, turn up the lights and join me for a discussion of all things dark and disturbing with V.P. Morris. Today, I am speaking to Connecticut's own award-winning author V.P. Morris, whose new novel, Dead Ringer, is available for your reading pleasure right now. Welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me back. Super excited.
It's my pleasure. You have the dubious distinction of being one of the few people who have suffered through this twice. So I apologize in advance, but kudos for your bravery.
Oh, not a big deal at all. I don't mind being one of the few who's been a repeat guest. I like being a repeat.
Well, there you go. Well, thanks for being here. And so, all right, you didn't even keep us waiting that long because it wasn't, too much over a year ago that we were talking about Shadowcast. And now we have Dead Ringer. And I have to ask you, this book has a terrific premise. Like when you hear the premise, you want to pick up the book and devour it. So can you just tell us simply what that premise is?
So the story follows Taylor Callahan, who is a 21-year-old sort of low-end criminal who's had a pretty rough life. And when she inadvertently causes the death of a teen girl who happens to look just like her, she decides to take over that teen girl's life. But soon she realizes that being the all-American good girl cheerleader is a lot harder than she thought it was, and also the family that she has infiltrated is hiding some very dark secrets.
They sure are. That's a good little teaser, though. So let me ask you, too, when you have a great premise like this, I sometimes feel like it's difficult to live up to that because you have to sustain it for the length of a novel. So can you talk about the challenge of having a really great premise and then delivering a manuscript, a full-length work that lives up to that and that sustains the suspense from first page to last? Is that a challenge?
It was kind of, as you'll see towards the middle section, there's a part that sort of does a lot of flashbacks to her past. I would say the hardest part was integrating the present drama with the past information, because I didn't want it to be an info dump of like, here's all the biological fact or the biography facts about this character. I wanted it to sort of also have its own arc, and it was difficult trying to weave those together. So that was probably the biggest challenge of making it all a one cohesive story.
Sure, and we actually may come back to that shortly. But the other thing that really struck me about this is you have a 21-year-old character who is assuming the identity of a teenager, and that sort of comes with its own challenges because not only does she have to fool this person's friends, but her family, local law enforcement, and Jamie's mom is actually a police officer, so she's a little bit more intuitive and insightful than some people might be. So can you talk specifically about the challenge of creating a character who assumes somebody else's identity and then has to convince the people that are closest to that person that it's really her?
Yeah, it's a lot to keep in your head because you have to think about how would Jamie, the original person, behave in those situations, or what was her quirks and her drive as a person, and then how would Taylor, with her own backstory and her own personality, try to imitate that, and how well can she pull off being someone else. And also, like, it's also about how people, different people in your life see you through different lenses. So you're not the same person you are around your mother or you are around your boyfriend or whatever. And having to pull that off when you're pretending to be someone else is quite difficult. And she uses a lot of her sort of street smarts that she learned being kind of living a rough life to survive. And I think she pulls off being a different person pretty well up until a point.
Up until a point, sure. And the interesting thing is, say what you want about social media, it's it's got its upsides and its drawbacks, but it does allow somebody like Taylor sort of intimate access to Jamie's life, because not only can she see her physical appearance, but she can hear how she speaks. So you can pick up so much information from another person just by looking at Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, and I think that makes it that much more believable too, because I think sometimes we don't realize what an intimate glimpse we can get into somebody else's life. But anyway, you were talking about Taylor and sort of her backstory and her motivations, and I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that a bit, because she realizes that going back to high school and assuming this identity really allows her to relive a period of her life that she didn't necessarily live to her fullest potential the first time. So can you talk about how that motivates her and sort of gives her a blank canvas to work with?
Yeah, so she dropped out of high school because she had a bad home life, a boyfriend who kind of took advantage of her and kind of pushed her into doing more crimes to sort of make money so they could survive without their parents' help. And it robbed her of a thing that I find to be like a very quintessential part of American life, which is going to high school, love it or hate it or feel neutral about it. It's something that it's kind of like a rite of passage for almost everyone who lives here. It's a lot more important to our, I guess, cultural identity, because other countries don't seem to have as many like TV shows about high school, or it's not this like pivotal, important moment the way it is here. At least that's the impression I've gotten by talking to other people who grew up in other countries. It seems like they're surprised that we're so obsessed with high school. And she felt like she really missed out on this thing that not only is like kind of a commonality amongst almost all people, it also sets you up for life. That if you can't graduate high school, you have a really hard time getting a job in this world. And then she has a criminal record on top of it. So it's really hard for her to set herself on the straight and narrow, and taking over Jamie's life is sort of the best way to do it, because she can sort of start from scratch, get that experience that everyone, or at least most people, want or get in their life here, and then sort of have a completely clean slate and be the person that she wants to be. Just the possibility of being someone new is sort of alluring. She doesn't even want to be like a rich, famous, amazing person. She just wants to be normal.
Right. And it's interesting that you would mention that, because, high school is so much a quintessential part of the American experience. And reading this book reminded me of that, because some people, their whole life sort of revolve around who they were in high school. Other people, like you mentioned, really want to sort of escape who they were then. But just reading some of these chapters, it brought back like the politics of the cafeteria. And I was like, whoa, PTSD. So I'm going to need my therapy bills. But no, it's just an interesting point, because it's so evocative, either, in a positive way or a negative way. But in America, that really is such a key experience. But I did want to ask you, about the upbringing of these characters, which I think you already touched on briefly. But a lot of times, we say, well, if kids act out, that's on the parents. It's all about the parenting. But, Jamie and Taylor had different mothers, different parental figures, grew up in very different environments. And yet, they both had some issues. So I'm wondering if you can talk about how the parenting, despite, the differences, how does that play into who they are or not? Because looking at Jamie's parents, you see one thing that outwardly may be a little bit different, and then a much different relationship between Taylor and her mom.
Yeah, so Taylor has, a much harder upbringing. She's being raised by a single mom who is not particularly the best parent. She seems to care more about herself and just sort of keeping her head above water than about being like an active and participating parent in her kids' lives. And she doesn't actually fully know who Taylor's biological father is. There's a little joke that it's either a chef or a guy who did a Ponzi scheme, and Taylor's pretty sure it's the Ponzi scheme guy, because she's really good at like little criminal enterprises. So She's kind of got that stacked against her from the beginning, and that they're also in a more poor and kind of crime-ridden neighborhood where Jamie, the Mackenzie family, is in. They're not particularly wealthy, but they're sort of solidly middle class. They're safe and stable. There's a two-parent household. They've got stable jobs. They are very involved in their kids' lives and sort of know little things, as we get a few chapters from Joan, who is the mother of Jamie, from her perspective, and she knows little things about her kid, like she wouldn't smile that way, she wouldn't react that way, where Taylor's mother wouldn't probably even notice that about her own children because she's kind of off doing her own thing. But even though they're very involved and loving to an extent, they take some of that sort of strictness and how good and bad, how one person ought to be, to the extreme and hold people to a very, very high standard, and bad things happen to people who do not hold up to that standard.
Very true. And I have to say, the part of the book that really made me laugh, and this is not a question, it's just an observation, but there's a point where, everybody thinks that Jamie, who is really Taylor, is going through this very difficult time because she's, living through the death of two of her friends and then sort of having to reacclimate to life without them by her side. And so, mom wants her to feel a bit better and makes her what she thinks is her favorite dinner and promptly serves like a tuna casserole. And tuna is the one thing that Taylor can't stand. And I just have to say, I got a real chuckle out of that, one, because it was funny, and two, because I don't particularly care for tuna myself. But, trying to assume somebody's idea and then somebody's identity, and then somebody places this big dish in front of you and is like, eat, honey, eat. This will make you feel better. Not so much. Okay. Yeah. I've digressed, but I just found that very amusing. So you mentioned earlier that one of the challenges for you in this particular book, is sort of writing from different perspectives and from different time periods, because not only do we have Taylor as a point of view character, but we have Jamie's mom, Joan, and we have sort of before and after the identity switch happened. So can you talk a bit about the complexities of that and how you planned for that and your sort of organizational, workup for this book?
Well, this book actually had far more rewrites than Shadowcast did. So I actually wrote Dead Ringer first, but it got published second, which is kind of commonplace. And I originally had it like one chapter or two chapters like present day, and then one or two chapters flashback. And an author friend of mine had read it and said that was like kind of confusing and hard to keep up with both the present and past drama at the same time. So that's why there's a middle part that goes into the past, like in depth, without sort of taking too much attention away from the current drama in the present. So I think it flows better that way, but it took some more kind of like zooming out and seeing it as a whole story, not just like present and past as separate. So I had to do a lot to sort of bridge how is this still relevant to who Taylor is and struggling with in the present as her fake identity as Jamie.
Sure. And I'm actually going to skip ahead because, you mentioned that you got some feedback on earlier versions of this book that actually caused you to do some, I guess, substantial revision. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering, so many people struggle with constructive criticism or feedback, and this is both receiving it and even giving it. It's kind of an art to give it, and it's kind of an art to receive it. So can you talk about, your relationship with beta readers and how maybe that's evolved over time and how you were able to deal with feedback when it's not always, positive, or it does necessitate some kind of change?
I've been pretty good at handling feedback, especially if the person who's giving it is very respectful and is not coming at it like an attacking manner. If they're just giving what worked and didn't work for their reading experience, I'm not going to be offended. There's only been like one time that an editor has ever like upset me. So the most like 99% of the time it's been like respectful and helpful and something for the most part I've taken into consideration. And it's just something that like you have to sort of, much like the mafia, it's business, not personal. Mm-hmm. So you have to just sort of remove that they're not criticizing you as a person. They're just, this particular thing is almost like an entity outside of you, even though you might feel very attached to it. You kind of just have to separate it and look at it more critically and take that emotion out. So you kind of have to switch that off and be prepared for it. Like if you're getting an email back from a beta reader and you're just like in a bad mood, maybe that day is not the day to read that email, wait till tomorrow or something. So I've also learned to only look at it when I'm like in the right mind frame. If I'm stressed out, I will look at it a different time.
Very wise. So sort of follow-up questions to that too. The other thing I wonder, because I know that sometimes people struggle with what their own instincts are as a storyteller versus feedback that might seem contrary to that. So how do you gauge when to listen to somebody else versus when to listen to your own instincts if you're sort of at an impasse with one another?
I mean, it's really hard because it is like a gut feeling. It's hard to explain. It's kind of like when people like have a sense that something is going to be dangerous, but they had no way to prove it. It's sort of like, yeah, a feeling that you get that this thing, even if it's being criticized, is the bedrock or is important to your story. I have an unpublished manuscript that I am querying right now that is set in 2003, and it is important for me that it takes place in the early 2000s. I don't want it set in modern day. And I got some feedback being like, oh, just set it in modern day. And I'm like, no, there is a reason I want it in the early aughts, and you may not get it, but it's like, for me, that part's really important. The rest, I took obviously other parts into consideration. And I was like, oh, I will definitely change that. But you have to have this feeling that like the story, like the deeper part inside you that wanted to tell that story, if that part feels like it's being damaged, then that's probably a criticism to ignore. If like the bedrock of the situation or the inspiration falls apart, if you remove that, then it's not the same story and you're not going to have the same passion. So you kind of have to just wing it on some respects.
Sure. No, that makes good sense. Thank you. So I wanted to ask you too, I know that you have an interest in criminality and psychology and the mind of, people who do terrible things. And I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about how that let you into the two, sort of point of view characters of Dead Ringer. How did you get into Taylor's mind? And then how did you get into, Joan Mackenzie's mind? And did you find that, you yourself as a mother, even though your child is much younger, does that play into it now that you have that experience yourself of being responsible, completely for a being?
Yeah, so to answer the first part, let's see. So, I mean, I saw Taylor first out of all the inspiration. It kind of came from multiple different sources, but the one time I remember hearing some woman talk about how when you have a teenager that it's like one day they wake up and they're a different person. And I kind of thought, well, what if that was true? Like, what if it actually happened that your sweet, innocent daughter woke up as a drug dealer the next day? And that's what happens in this book. And I just liked Taylor's feistiness. She is far more of a active protagonist with agency. I don't see, or I've run into too many thrillers where the female protagonist is a bit of a damsel in distress, or is just like thrown into a situation that she has absolutely no skill set, or just it's not her. Like she's a baker and she gets thrown into like a murder investigation with some grisly serial killer, so she's completely outmatched. And I wanted to have a protagonist who is not completely outmatched by the villain of the piece, that even though that person might have other resources and a motive that she doesn't know at first, she's still smart and capable and has dealt with very difficult, awful people in the past. So this is not like a big, super, thing that she's never dealt with before. Sure. And with Joan, I've run into a lot of people in my lifetime that are, even though they may not be doing some of the nefarious acts that she ends up getting up to, they're very quick to judge people, that they do one thing, whether it's a crime or if it's just some small infraction at school, like it's a detention, and they're instantly like, that person's a bad seed. Don't hang out with them. Don't talk to them. That they're showing their true colors. And I just kind of took that mentality of like, one strike equals you're out, and put it to the hardest extreme that you can. But I do get from her standpoint, she is trying to protect her family in some sense. It's kind of like her mothering instinct is like too evolved. She went a little crazy. So I understand now that I'm a parent, because I wrote this a few years before I had a child. I understand the desire to like fiercely protect your family from any outside threats, but she definitely goes a little too hard.
Yes, she takes it to an extreme. Kind of fun.
Mhm.
So let me ask you too. I know that you mentioned that you started this book, many years ago, and it actually was largely written before your debut novel
Mhm.
was published. So I'm wondering, what caused you to come back to this story? How did you know that you couldn't let it get away? Because so many people, lose enthusiasm for a project, and then they kind of never look at it again, and there's all that wasted potential. But you actually, did the revisitation and have a book because of it. So what spoke to you about this one?
I just, I really liked Taylor a lot. Like, she felt like a person that I would want to be friends with, like if she could keep some of her like shittier behavior in check. I would, she seems interesting and fun, and like a person who has more depth to them than what meets the eye. And I wanted to have, I actually kind of, it seems weird, but like when I would take a break from writing or revising this manuscript, I kind of like missed her a little bit. And it seems creepy because she's not real. But I kind of missed her personality. Not that I do like my protagonist from my other novel and short stories and other works that I have, but there was something about her that made me feel like I could, like, if she was a person in real life, I would enjoy her company, and I didn't want to give that up.
Sure. No, that's a good
Mhm.
sign. If your characters actually draw you back to them, there's probably a reason.
Mhm.
All right, so we'll move away from Dead Ringer and get a bit more broad in a minute, but I did want to ask you to, in a non-spoilery fashion, but I know you've talked a bit about this before. The book is very dark,
Mhm.
obviously. People can get a sense of that. And so it sort of has a kind of dark ending. And I'm
Mhm.
wondering, if you can talk about that and weighing sort of what readers expect versus what you give them and what's fitting of the story, because it's a really ballsy ending, but it's
Yeah.
also a very ballsy story to beginning, so it's kind of
Mhm.
fitting.
Well, I wanted it to be, without spoiling it too much, I kind of wanted it to be a bit realistic, that, not everyone gets what they want in real life. And even though I do like a thriller that ends with a happy ending, and I don't always want to be around, the glum, nihilistic type. I mean, not, I don't think my ending is nihilistic, but there can be thrillers that go the opposite direction and sort of take everything from their characters at the end. And I wanted it to be kind of a balance of realistic stuff. And I also wanted to hint at the very last, at the epilogue, that even though things may not turn out the way the protagonist wanted, or the way you as a reader wanted, that there still has an opportunity for justice to happen. And I think that's kind of the thesis, is like that the spirit of justice is alive, even though there's a lot of injustice in the world.
Sure, I love that. And what I really liked is
Mhm.
it seemed like sort of a poetic ending. So it's not gimmicky. You get there and you
Mhm.
read it and it makes you think, but you also say, all right, this is kind of entirely fitting of the several hundred pages that came
Mhm.
before it. So, okay, we're going to move away from Dead Ringer so that, people pick it up and read it for
Mhm.
themselves. But I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind giving us just a little bit of an overview of some of your other projects, because last time you were on, Shadowcast, which was your
Mhm.
debut, that had just come out. You've written an abundance of short stories. You have an
Mhm.
award-winning podcast. So what else, can people find from you if they're looking for more? And why wouldn't they?
Yeah, so Shadowcast is my other novel that's available now. It's on Amazon like everything else. And that follows a true crime podcaster who's trying to find out who either kidnapped or killed her childhood best friend, and the perpetrator is listening in and messing with the investigation. So if that sounds like it's up your alley, please pick that one up as well. Also, it's a Amazon Kindle exclusive. There's 3 short stories that are just like, they're longer short stories, just like under a novella. They're 99 cents. They're super quick and easy to read. So if you're not in the mood for a big, long novel, check these out. They're called Exit 13, January Release, and Legacy Employees. And they all feature a haunting in an unusual place. So it's a bit more on the supernatural side of things. And I do have a podcast that wrapped earlier in 2021 called the Dead Letters Podcast. It's purely fictional, about a young woman who gets these mysterious letters in the mail that oddly predict things in her life, and it turns out they are being sent from like 175 years in the past. So it has a kind of a nice creepy atmosphere, if that's what you're into. That's also on all of the major podcatchers. I'm also a recurring guest on the podcast called Watch If You Dare, which is about horror movies, and specifically getting into the horror genre if you are a scaredy cat or a newbie. So, you don't have to like all of the scary stuff. It's kind of like easing yourself into it.
Sure. Awesome. So let me ask you, when we think of writing, we often think that it's a very solitary endeavor. And in a lot of ways, it's become more so during the pandemic. People haven't been able to get out as much. It's sort of been harder to cultivate or sustain a community of writers. But on the other hand, then there's, sort of social media, and people are meeting up virtually and they're engaging their group in different ways. I'm wondering, if you can talk about your relationship with other writers or readers during the pandemic, how that may have changed, and how you found that social media can be an asset when you might not be out there in person as you once were.
Yeah, I mean, I had a child in 2020, so like I was like doubly locked in. So I was, stuck at home with a baby, and the world was kind of ending. So I didn't have at the very beginning, obviously I was too exhausted to do much writing, but that was kind of the good thing about social media, is that even though I wasn't actively writing any novels or short stories at that time, I could still kind of keep up with people and sort of feel included in the world I was taking a short break from. So that makes you feel less alone, or like, it's still waiting for you, essentially. It's not completely gone, even if you're not actively working on it at that moment. And, I hadn't done any sort of tours or in-person things because we just didn't know what the world was going to be like. I got my first contract in April of 2020, and we kind of thought like, oh, the world will be back to normal in February 21, right? And then it just didn't. And so we're kind of like, I guess we'll just do digital things. And the same with Dead Ringer, it was right on the cusp of like mask mandates going away, and capacity limits going away. And so I'm just now starting to get back into the in-person part, which I really have missed. But the good thing about us writers, we tend to be kind of introverted and addicted to social media. So it's always still around. That's the good thing. You don't have to. It's not like if your passion was like playing soccer, you can't really do that online. So you have to wait for soccer games to resume. But it still kind of, the connection still kind of continued. And also, like, Gabby's Writers Club is still virtual, so that allows for people to join. And so it's it wasn't like everything was lost. It was like everything was on pause.
Sure. And like you said, our screens are always there, so we're never completely alone. Even when you think you are, you're connected to people, all over the place. But you mentioned new motherhood too, and I wanted to ask you about that because, I'm sure that is a huge adjustment. Last time we spoke, I don't even think your son was 1 yet, so very, very young, and I think now he's closer to 2. So, how has your relationship with writing changed as your child has grown and aged a bit?
Well, it's been good because once he's on like a normal sleep schedule, not only am I sleeping better and can function like a person, I use his nap times to write. So I kind of got into a routine, and one of the good advice they say about writing is like, if you're going to write every day or close to every day, to do it around the same time, because your body will kind of, like a circadian rhythm will kind of be like, oh, it's noon equals writing. So he would go down for a nap in midday. And so now, even if he's like away at his grandparents for the day or something, if it's like 12:30ish, I'm kind of like, I have to write. I have to, like, it's an urge. So even though it's difficult juggling a toddler and a writing career, it kind of forces you into a schedule where if I didn't have him, I kind of would be like, I'll just do it on the weekends, or I'll just do it next week. And I don't really have that luxury to kind of just willy-nilly schedule things. So if I have 2 hours in the middle of the day, I use them. So it actually is helpful in a way, even though it can be a little stressful at the same time.
Sure, it's sort of like that use it or lose it philosophy when your time is that precious.
Yeah.
So I'm sure last time we spoke, I probably asked you my standard question in terms of, best advice gotten and best advice never gotten that you've learned for yourself. So rather than going down that route completely, I'm just going to ask you if you have any words, of guidance, advice, or support for aspiring writers. And then maybe I'll have some fun with it later and compare and contrast with what you said last year.
Oh, that's interesting. I hope I'm not repeating myself, but I'm also hoping I'm not contradicting myself. I don't think I am. I think
I'm
I
sure
should
that's
be
half the
good.
fun, but
Yeah. I guess the thing is to just to keep trying, and also if you do need to take a pause, I paused because I had a child, but if you have another thing like a health thing, or you just are busy, it's fine to take a short pause as long as you are making a commitment to come back. Have a date in mind that oh, I'm just going to pause for the summer or for the month of January and then come back to it. Yeah, so it's about lasting, but some people get too carried away in the write every day thing, which it can be helpful, and it's something I've done. I sometimes write every weekday, but it's not set in stone. So I think some newer writers get oh no, I missed 3 days of writing, it must mean I'm a failure, I'm never going to be able to do this. And it's no, it happens. I've been months without writing. It's not a death sentence. So it's keep at it, but keep your pace. It's a marathon, not a sprint. So don't beat yourself up if you miss, a few days or a few weeks. Or just get back on the saddle. Don't let it go too long, but make a point to return.
That's great advice because, life does happen and sometimes you need to make space for that. And it's funny we say so often we need to give ourselves permission to write, but there's the flip side of that coin where sometimes you do need to allow yourself permission to not write. And that's not something that people say very often, but I think that that's really, really important. So thank you for sharing that. 2 more questions for you, and then I will let you get back to your crazy busy life. But I wanted to ask you, people are always looking for recommendations, and you sort of are a connoisseur of scary, suspenseful, horrific entertainment things. It's not just books, but, I'm giving people the wrong idea about you. You're quite lovely and nice, but, you like dark things. But I'm wondering, knowing that, you not only are a reader, but you're into television, film, podcasts, do you have anything that you've encountered recently or that just you find evergreen that you would recommend to people who like stuff in this vein?
Yeah, I mean, I've been reading some really good stuff. I've actually did a challenge, which you might find this amusing since you're a book lover. I went through all of my social media because I bookmark books that are interesting. So it's kind of like my TBR, and I made a huge Excel sheet of everything I had saved, and I am forcing myself to read all of them, and I'm not allowed to add anything to it until it's done. So I've been trying to go through it as quickly as possible because of course I want to add to it. So I've been reading a lot of good stuff, and I recently finished The Burning Girls by C.J. Tudor. It is very good. It's on the thriller suspense side, nothing too particularly horrific and gory, at least not the vast majority, so nothing to scare anyone off. The Only Good Indians by oh goodness, Stephen Graham Jones, I believe, yes, is also excellent. That's sort of a slow burn, kind of highbrow horror. There is some gore, but it's not, I think it's nothing that people can't handle, but I have a higher tolerance maybe. And if you like the ultra creepy and you want to get a very in-depth experience, I recommend the podcast Scare You to Sleep, where they kind of do ASMR, but it's scary.
Nice. All right. So final question, you've told us all about the things that we can find now, but you did mention, that you have a 3rd manuscript out there right now. And I know it's a little bit of a departure for you. So I'm just wondering if you can, leave us with a little teaser of what we might expect next from you.
Yeah. So during the pandemic, I wanted to get back to writing, as I mentioned, with, having a break because I had a child, but with all of the sadness that was going on in the world, and it felt like we would never reopen, I couldn't really get myself to write another thriller, even though I had outlined one that I really was interested in. I just couldn't bring myself to do it and get into that mind space of another person who would be, a similar vein to my first novel, like a serial killer, scary type person. I couldn't bring myself to do that at that time. So I actually wrote a YA romance set in 2003, which, as I mentioned earlier, I've liked both genres. I mean, obviously grew up reading YA because most people that's kind of cut their teeth on books meant for younger people, and it is kind of like a Romy Michelle's high school reunion meets Mean Girls in a way. So it's a complete departure. I kind of would like to balance both ends of the spectrum a bit, and I do. My next one will be back into the thriller world. So hopefully maybe that one will come out. It would be under a different pen name most likely so that the young readers don't accidentally pick up a book about people getting murdered. But I'm currently trying to get that one picked up. So hopefully, knock on wood, that ends up being able for people to purchase.
Most excellent. And in the meantime, they can pick up Dead Ringer, which is available right now. And, once you read this, you're going to want to read everything that V.P. Morris has written. Thank you so much for being here. It's so nice.
Yeah, thank you for having me. So I will be doing a bit of an author talk about my books and also how to write a good thriller and how to add suspense into your writing at the Norwalk Library. It'll be Saturday, the 23rd of July at 11 a.m. So keep an eye out for that. And also my social media is at twriterepeat on Twitter and Instagram. So I'll be posting info about more in-person stuff that I have in the works that I just don't have dates for yet. So stay tuned. That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.